Today, we're diving into a really turbulent period in European history, a time when art, politics, and just sheer poverty all collided to create this massive explosion of revolutions. Okay, so let's jump right in with this quote. It's from Clemens von Metternich, and you gotta understand, this guy was basically the architect of post-Napoleonic Europe, a powerful conservative. He just knew that the revolutionary ideas bubbling up in France were like a virus that was not gonna stay put. And boy, was he right. This wasn't just about one country's political drama. Nope, it was about an entire continent that was basically a tinderbox, just waiting for a single spark to set the whole thing ablaze. So, what happens when you mix those things together? Throughout this explainer, we're going to see how three key ingredients — you've got political upheaval, a totally new cultural identity, and just raw economic desperation — all combined to create this perfect storm of revolution. So, let's start with that first sneeze in France, the political spark that showed everyone just how fragile the old order of kings and emperors really was. See, after Napoleon was defeated, the big conservative powers in Europe tried to literally turn back the clock. They put the old royal families, like the Bourbons in France, right back on their thrones. But here's the thing, you can't just put the genie back in the bottle. The ideas of liberty and having a say in your own government had been let loose, and the people of Paris pushed back, and they pushed back hard. And just like Metternich was afraid of, that cold spread fast. The news from Paris directly inspired an uprising in Brussels just a month later. And what happened? An entirely new country was born, Belgium. The dominoes were starting to fall. So the political dominoes are falling. But what's actually pushing them over? Well, that brings us to our second key ingredient. This wasn't just a political fight. It was being powered by this huge cultural movement that gave people a brand new way of thinking about who they were. Romanticism. It was basically a huge rebellion against the Enlightenment and its obsession with cold, hard logic. Romantic artists and thinkers, they celebrated everything that movement had kind of pushed aside. Passion, gut feelings, and this idea of a shared, almost spiritual connection that binds a people together through their language and culture. And this leads to this really radical new concept from the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder. He argued that the true spirit of the nation, the Volksgeist, it wasn't in the fancy Latin-speaking aristocrats. No, it was in the folk songs, the fairy tales, and the dances of the common people, das Volk. I mean, this was a revolutionary idea. And nationalists put this idea into practice, immediately. So you have the Grimm brothers. They weren't just collecting stories for kids. They were actively trying to define what a German national spirit was. Or look at occupied Poland, or Russia had banned the Polish language in schools. Just dancing the Polonaise became an act of political defiance. Culture was now a weapon. It was a way to build a national identity that everyone, even people who couldn't read, could share in. Now, all these new ideas about the nation, they're powerful stuff, but they don't exactly fill an empty stomach, do they? And that brings us to our third and maybe most visceral ingredient, the grim reality of daily life for millions of Europeans. While educated liberals were off debating constitutions, the poor were just trying to survive. You've got this just perfect storm of misery brewing. The population was booming, so cities were overflowing with people desperate for work, but there weren't enough jobs. Local weavers and artisans were getting wiped out by a flood of cheap, machine-made stuff from England, and out in the countryside, peasants were still being crushed by these ancient feudal obligations to their landlords. And the final blow? A string of bad harvests that sent food prices through the roof, tipping millions from poverty into actual starvation. And this journalist's account of the weavers' revolt, man, it's just a raw snapshot of that desperation boiling over. This wasn't some high-minded political debate. This was a gut-level cry for survival. They march for higher wages, they get treated with contempt, and their frustration just explodes into violence. And that tragic ending with the army shooting them down, it just shows you how incredibly high the stakes were. And all of this brings us to the big one, the climax. The year 1848, often called the Spring of the Peoples, is when all of these pressures, the political, the cultural, and the economic, finally just exploded all at once across the entire continent. And guess where it starts? Paris. Again. It was the same story of hunger and joblessness, but this time it was on a massive scale. The king had to literally run for his life, and right there on the spot, a new republic was declared, one that promised the right to work and gave all adult men the right to vote.
Okay, and this right here is probably the most important thing to get about 1848. It was really two different revolutions happening at the same time. Out in the streets, you had starving workers and peasants fighting for very concrete things, bread and a job. But at the same time, in the assembly halls, you had these educated, middle-class liberals fighting for abstract ideas, a constitution, freedom of the press, a unified nation. And as we're going to see, their goals were not always the same.
This was the liberals' big moment. In the German states, hundreds of elected professionals, businessmen, and artisans all got together at the Frankfurt Parliament. Their goal was to build their dream government from the ground up, a unified Germany led by a monarch, but kept in check by a powerful elected parliament. But what did it all amount to? A big, fat zero. They offered the crown of this new unified Germany to the King of Prussia, and he flat out rejected it. He sneered that he wouldn't accept a crown from the gutter. And without the backing of a powerful king, and with the old aristocracy and the military all lined up against them, the Liberals' parliament just collapsed. So, on the surface, the revolutions of 1848 look like a total failure, right? The barricades came down, the kings came back. But they left a permanent mark on Europe, and they raised some really big questions that just could not be ignored. And one of the biggest, most explosive questions left hanging was, what about the women? Women had been right there on the front lines. They had formed political clubs, they published newspapers, but when it came time to actually hand out rights, the liberal men who were leading the charge overwhelmingly said no and denied them the vote. And this slide just lays out the debate perfectly. On one side, you have guys like the politician Karl Welcker arguing that giving women rights would basically destroy the family, that a woman's place is in the home. But then you had passionate activists like Louise Otto Peters firing back that liberty is indivisible. You can't have free men surrounded by unfree people. This wasn't a side issue. It was a fundamental debate about what freedom even meant. So even though the conservatives kind of won the battle, in the long run, they couldn't win the war to turn back time. The monarchs realized they couldn't just keep stamping people down. To survive, they had to start giving in a little. And critically, those old systems of serfdom and bonded labor were finally abolished in huge parts of Central and Eastern Europe. The revolution had forced the old world, kicking and screaming, to modernize. And that brings us back to this powerful statement from Louise Otto Peters, because it really captures the unfinished business of 1848. It asks a profound question. Can a society really call itself free if that freedom only applies to half the population? In the end, the revolutions of 1848 really raised more questions than they answered. They unleashed these powerful new ideas of the nation and of liberty, but the struggle to define who was included in that new nation and who was actually entitled to that liberty, well, that would continue to echo through Europe for generations to come.